I came home after 15 years abroad. With one stop, left a small flower shop, a bouquet of sunflowers, a surprise for my daughter. I stepped out of the cab. A woman in a worn coat was standing outside holding a small child against her side. She looked up. Then she ran toward me, sobbing, grabbing my arms with both hands. "Dad, you're still alive." They lied to me. I could not move. I could not speak. 15 years. And this was what I came home to. You are watching Dad's Revenge Stories, and I'm deeply thankful for your support. Let me know your city or country in the comments below. Before we continue, please note that some fictional adaptations were made for entertainment and educational value. Any resemblance to actual identities or places is completely accidental, but the core lesson is highly practical. The pilot announced our final descent into Los Angeles at 4:43 in the afternoon, and I pressed my palm flat against the cold oval window and looked down at a city I had not seen in 15 years. From 30,000 feet, Los Angeles looked exactly the way I remembered it, the endless sprawl of rooftops stretching from the mountains to the ocean, the tangle of freeways catching the late October sun like silver thread, the smudge of downtown towers rising through the haze in the distance. It looked like home. It looked like everything I had been carrying in my chest across 3 continents and 15 years of offshore platforms and bare-walled apartments that never once felt like a place a person actually lived. I had a photograph in my shirt pocket. Sophie at 23 standing in the driveway of her house on Birchwood Lane laughing at something I had said just before I snapped the picture. Her hair was loose. She was wearing the blue jacket Eleanor had bought her the previous spring. I had carried that photograph through Singapore and Aberdeen and the Gulf of Mexico, through 2 hurricanes and 1 equipment failure that nearly took 3 men with it, and I had looked at it so many times the edges had gone soft and the color had faded slightly at the corners. But her laugh was still there. I could still see it. I told myself she would look up from whatever she was doing when I knocked on the door, and her face would do the thing it always did, that split second of pure surprise before the smile broke through completely. I had replayed that moment 10,000 times. I had earned it. I was 40 minutes from having it. The taxi driver was a young man named Carlos, who had a pine tree air freshener swinging from the rearview mirror and a talk radio station playing low on the dashboard. He glanced at me in the mirror as we merged onto the 405. "First time back in a while?" he asked. 15 years, I said. He let out a slow whistle. "That is a long stretch, man. You got family here." I pulled the photograph out of my shirt pocket and held it up. "My daughter, and a granddaughter I have never actually met in person. Her name is Lily. She is 8 years old." Carlos glanced at the photograph and grinned. "She is going to lose her mind when she sees you." "That is the plan," I said. But somewhere around the exit for Culver City I decided to stop. Not at the house, not yet. I wanted to bring something. Flowers felt right. Sophie had always loved sunflowers, the big, heavy-headed kind that drooped a little by evening and still managed to look cheerful about it. Eleanor had mentioned in one of her emails that there was a flower shop somewhere in a small town off the main road, a little place tucked between a bakery and a dry cleaner. I had the address saved on my phone from months ago when I had first started thinking about how exactly I wanted to come home. I asked Carlos to take the exit. The town was the kind of place that exists just outside the edge of the city, not quite suburban, not quite rural, a handful of storefronts along a main street with a water tower visible above the roofline at the far end. The flower shop was exactly where Eleanor's email had described it. Hand-lettered sign above the door. Window boxes going brown at the edges in the October cool. A small chalkboard on the sidewalk that read, "Fresh arrangements, daily walk-ins, welcome." I paid Carlos, told him not to wait, and pulled my carry-on bag onto the sidewalk. That was when I saw her. A woman was sitting on the front step of the flower shop, her back against the door frame, a child of maybe 8 years old, pressed against her side. The woman's coat was 2 sizes too large, the kind of coat you find when you are choosing warmth over everything else. Her hair was pulled back roughly, a loose strand falling across her cheek. The child had her face buried against the woman's arm. Neither of them was looking at me. My first thought was that she was a customer waiting for the shop to open. My second thought, which arrived half a second later and hit me somewhere behind the sternum, was something I could not immediately put into words. A pulling sensation, like a current beneath still water, like my body understood something my mind had not yet caught up to. I took one step toward them. The woman looked up. The world went completely still. She had Eleanor's coloring in her hair, but she had Eleanor's coloring in nothing else. The shape of her nose, the line of her jaw, the precise angle of her cheekbones in the afternoon light. I had held this face in a hospital room 38 years ago when she weighed 6 pounds, and I was 29 years old and more terrified than I had ever been in my life. I had memorized every line of it in the photograph I had carried across 3 continents. "Sophie," I said. The word came out barely above a breath. She stared at me. Her lips parted. Her face went through 3 separate things in the space of 2 seconds. Recognition, disbelief, and then something that cracked straight through both of them, like a fault line giving way. She scrambled to her feet so fast, the little girl stumbled sideways and caught herself on the door frame. Sophie crossed the sidewalk in 4 steps and slammed into me so hard I had to take a step back to stay upright, both arms locking around my neck, her whole body shaking with sobs she could not control and was not trying to. "Dad," the word tore out of her. "Dad. You're still alive. They told me they said you were gone. They made me go to Singapore. They showed me the ad. You're real. You're actually—" She could not finish. Her knees buckled slightly, and I tightened my grip and held her up. My chin pressed against the top of her head, my eyes burning so fiercely I stopped fighting it entirely. The little girl was standing in the doorway of the shop. She was watching us with the careful assessing eyes of a child who had learned to read situations before they developed. Dark-haired, sharp-eyed, one hand gripping the doorframe. She was wearing a backpack that looked too heavy for her frame. "Sophie," I said, my voice wrecked and unsteady. "Sophie, who is this?" Sophie pulled back just enough to look at me. Tears were running freely down her face, and her jaw was trembling with the force of everything she was trying to hold inside and failing to contain. She turned toward the little girl and stretched one arm out. "Lily," she said. "Come here, baby. Come meet your grandfather." Lily did not move right away. She studied my face from the doorway with an expression far too serious for an 8-year-old, the expression of a child who had been taught by experience to verify things before she trusted them. Then she took 1 step forward. 2, 3. She stopped directly in front of me and looked up. "Grandma Eleanor told us you were in heaven," she said. Her voice was quiet and very precise. "She said you got sick and you didn't make it." My chest tightened so sharply, it took a moment to draw a full breath. "I know," I said. My voice was shaking. "I know that is what she said." Lily studied me for 3 more seconds. Then she wrapped both arms around my waist and pressed her face against my coat and held on with the fierce, total grip of a child who had been waiting for something she had been told she would never have. From the bakery next door, a man in an apron appeared briefly in the doorway, took one look at the 3 of us on the sidewalk, and quietly reached back and turned his door sign from open to closed. He gave me a single nod before stepping back inside. I stood on that sidewalk in a small town outside Los Angeles, on a late October afternoon, holding my daughter and my granddaughter for the first time in 15 years, and I understood in that moment that the homecoming I had imagined for a decade and a half was not the one I was standing inside of. Something had happened to my family while I was gone, and I had not the faintest idea yet how much. He had known Sophie for 2 years, known who she was from the moment Martha brought her to this street, and he had kept that knowledge the way a person keeps something fragile, carefully, quietly, without ever once letting it show. He flipped the lock on his bakery's connecting door, walked through to the flower shop, pulled 3 chairs into a rough circle near the workbench, and set a box of tissues on the edge without a word. Then he positioned himself at the front window and watched the street with his arms crossed his back to us, giving us the only privacy the situation allowed. I have thought about that gesture many times since. It cost him nothing and meant everything. Sophie sat across from me with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug Kevin had pressed into her grip before she could refuse. She was not crying anymore. She had moved through crying and come out the other side into something harder and quieter, the particular steadiness of a person who has run out of tears for this specific pain because she has already spent all of them alone over a long period of time. Lily had positioned herself on the floor between us with a coloring book open in her lap, her tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth the way it was I would learn whenever she was concentrating. She was listening to every word. She just needed her hands to be doing something in order to manage it. "Tell me everything," I said. "From the beginning." Sophie tightened her grip on the mug. Her knuckles went white. "Eleanor called me on a Thursday morning," she said. "About 4 years ago. She was crying, genuinely, crying, Dad. The kind that sounds real, because the breath catches, and you can hear the person trying to pull themselves together and failing. She said you had collapsed on the platform. Cardiac event. That by the time the emergency team reached you, it was already too late." My stomach dropped the way it drops on a roller coaster, that hollow, sickening lurch that your body registers before your mind catches up. "She said she was handling the overseas arrangements personally," Sophie continued. Her voice was flat, in the way voices go flat when a story has been rehearsed so many times that the emotion has been worn smooth like a stone at the bottom of a river. That there was nothing I needed to do except grieve. 3 days later, she called again and said she had booked flights for both of us to Singapore. She said you had wanted to be buried there near where you had worked. "I never said that," I said. "I know that now." Sophie looked at me with eyes that had stopped being surprised by anything. "But I didn't know it then. I got on the plane, Dad. What else was I supposed to do?" She told me about the cemetery outside Singapore. A private plot, a polished headstone, a service attended by 2 men she had never seen before, who Eleanor introduced as colleagues from the offshore company. Eleanor cried the entire time. Sophie stood at the foot of the grave and felt the ground tilt underneath her and held Lily's hand so tightly that Lily later told her it had hurt, but Lily had not said a word at the time. "She made me put flowers on it," Sophie said. Her voice cracked down the middle on that sentence, and she pressed her lips together hard until she had it back under control. "Yellow sunflowers. She said that's what you would have wanted. And I stood there and put your flowers on an empty grave, and I didn't know, I had absolutely no idea." "It wasn't empty," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. "Was it?" Sophie shook her head slowly. "Eleanor told me later back in LA. Said the casket held some of your personal effects. Your old work boots, your navy jacket, the one you wore every Sunday." She stopped, swallowed. "I thought that was why it felt so real. Because your things were in there." The navy jacket. I had left it hanging on a hook in the apartment storage room when I shipped out to the Gulf rig. Eleanor had access to that room. She had always had access to everything. Kevin said something low from the window, not to us, just to himself, a single syllable under his breath that conveyed more than a full sentence would have. "What about Aunt Martha?" I asked. "Did Eleanor contact her?" The grief that moved across Sophie's face at that question was different from what had come before. Quieter, more complicated. "Martha got the same call," she said. "The same morning. Eleanor told her separately." Sophie set the coffee mug down carefully on the workbench beside her. "Aunt Martha flew in from Portland for the service. She sat in the front row at the memorial and held my hand the whole time and cried harder than anyone in the room." Sophie looked at me steadily. "She believed it completely, Dad. She had no reason not to. Neither of us did." Lily looked up from her coloring book. "Grandma Eleanor cried a lot," she said. She said it with the matter-of-fact directness of a child reporting observed data. But her eyes were always dry after, like right after. I noticed that. The room went very quiet. I stared at my granddaughter. 8 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor of a flower shop, telling me she had clocked the absence of actual tears in a grown woman's grief performance because she had been paying attention in the way children pay attention when the adults around them are not entirely safe. "Smart girl," Kevin said from the window. He did not turn around. "The money," I said. I kept my voice level because I needed Sophie to keep talking, and I could feel what was building underneath my own surface, and I did not trust it yet. "In 15 years, I wired money home every single month without fail. Sophie, where did that money go?" Sophie looked at me across the small circle of chairs. "I never saw it," she said. "Not $1, not once." The floor seemed to shift slightly beneath my feet. I reached sideways and gripped the edge of the workbench and held on. "Not $1, I repeated. "When the debt letters started coming," Sophie said, and her voice was steady now in the way that steady can mean completely hollowed out, "I assumed it was a mistake. I called the numbers on the statements and explained very calmly that I had not borrowed this money, that these accounts were not mine." She paused. "Every single one of them had my full legal name, my date of birth, my social security number. The signatures on the applications looked close enough to mine that even I second-guessed myself." Lily had stopped coloring. She was watching her mother's face with those careful, serious eyes. "I sold the car first," Sophie said. "Then the dining table. Then the jewelry box." She stopped on those last 3 words. I knew what was in that jewelry box. I had given most of it to Diana, and Diana had given most of it to Sophie, and it had passed between the women in my family across 30 years of birthdays and graduations and ordinary Tuesdays when Diana decided that love needed to be made visible. "Sophie," I said. "Not tonight," she said quietly. "I'll tell you all of it. Just not tonight." I nodded. My throat had closed to the width of a straw, and talking through it felt impossible anyway. Kevin turned from the window then. He looked at me directly for the first time since we had sat down, and in his expression was something I recognized, the look of a man who has been carrying someone else's weight alongside them and is relieved finally to see someone arrive who is built for it. "Mr. Harmon," he said, "there is a motel 2 blocks north. Clean safe, takes cash. I already called ahead." He reached into his apron pocket and set a key card on the workbench between us. "Sophie and Lily are in the room next to yours. They moved in 6 months ago when the apartment above the dry cleaner had a roof leak, and I told them not to go back." I picked up the key card. "Thank you," I said. The words felt completely inadequate. I said them anyway. Kevin shrugged with the particular economy of a man who considers decency unremarkable. "She needed someone to show up," he said. "Tonight that's you." He was right about that. But as I looked at Sophie across that circle of chairs, at the hollows under her eyes, and the careful way she held her shoulders, and the coffee mug she was gripping, like it was the one solid thing, in a room full of things that could shift, a question was forming at the back of my mind that had not stopped pressing since the moment she told me she had never seen a dollar of the money I sent. 180 transfers. 15 years. Every 15th of the month like a machine. Where had $3.5 million gone? The motel room was clean. The way motel rooms are clean when someone has worked very hard to make them, so the kind of clean that smells like effort rather than comfort. Bleach underneath the faint ghost of air freshener towels folded with military precision on a rack that had been screwed into the wall slightly off-center. I sat at the small desk by the window, opened my laptop, and did not think about sleeping because sleeping was not something that was going to happen tonight. The question Sophie had left me with was sitting in the center of my chest like a stone that had been dropped from a considerable height. 180 transfers. Every 15th of the month for 15 years. I had never missed one. Not during hurricanes, not during equipment failures, not during the stretch of 8 months when I was stationed on a rig in the North Sea, with communication windows so narrow I had to schedule every personal call 2 weeks in advance. The money left my account on the 15th, and I considered the matter handled. I had built my entire life overseas on the assumption that the people you trust will behave like people who deserve trust. I logged into my overseas banking portal. The transfers were all there, clean, consistent, one per month, always on the 15th, always the same receiving account. I clicked on the account number. I had never examined it closely before. Why would I? The money cleared on schedule. That had always been the end of my involvement. But now I looked. The account was registered under the name Sophie Harmon. That part appeared correct, but the email address listed for account notifications was one I had never seen, not Sophie's personal address, not any address I recognized. A string of random letters and numbers at a provider I had never used. And the phone number attached for two-factor authentication had a Houston area code that I had never dialed in my life. My hand went completely still on the mouse. I picked up my phone and called the Houston number. It rang 4 times and rolled to a voicemail with no greeting, just a long beep and silence on the other end. I hung up. I went back to the transaction page and pulled up every transfer one by one and added them in my head before I let myself use the calculator, because I needed the number to land the way things land when your own mind assembles them. Then I used the calculator anyway, because I needed to see it in digits. $3,500,000. I said it aloud in the empty motel room, quietly. The way you repeat something when the first time does not take, when your brain simply refuses to absorb the figure and you have to try again with your own voice to confirm it is real. $3.5 million. Wired faithfully every 15th of every month for 15 years into an account that carried my daughter's name but used contact information. She had never seen a phone number. She had never held an email address that had never belonged to her. She set it up before I left, I said to no one. My voice sounded strange to me in that room. Flat and hollow and very, very calm. The particular calm that lives on the other side of something enormous after the shock has passed through you and rearranged everything it touched. I picked up my phone and called Robert Caldwell. Robert had been my attorney and one of my closest friends for 30 years. We had met at a business conference in Fort Worth in 1995, argued about contract law over terrible hotel coffee, and had been arguing productively ever since. He was 67 years old, semi-retired, and sharper than men half his age on the best days, and sharper still on the days that required it. He answered on the second ring, despite the fact that it was nearly 11:30 at night. His voice alert immediately, the voice of a man whose instincts had been sharpened by 3 decades of receiving difficult news at inconvenient hours. "Richard," he said. "Where are you?" "Small town outside LA," I said. "I came back early. Robert, I need you to listen to me very carefully right now." "I'm listening," he said, and he was completely with every part of his attention locked onto the line. I could feel it. I told him everything. Sophie on the sidewalk outside the flower shop, the motel, the death certificate, the fake funeral in Singapore, and then the account number, the unfamiliar email, the Houston phone number, and the total that was still glowing on my laptop screen in the dark room. Robert did not interrupt once. He listened the way good attorneys listen, building the structure of what he was hearing in real time, fitting each piece against the ones before it, testing the joints. When I finished, there was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. "Read me the account number," he said. I read it, and the email address on the account. I read that too. I heard him writing. "Robert?" My voice had dropped to something I barely recognized. "What are we looking at?" "What we are looking at," Robert said carefully, "is a scheme in which someone opened a fraudulent account in your daughter's name, used false contact information to redirect 15 years of wire transfers into it, and maintained that redirection without either you or your bank flagging the discrepancy." He paused. "Under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1343, that constitutes wire fraud. It is a federal criminal offense. Each individual transfer is a separate count, Richard. You made 180 transfers." The number hung in the air of the motel room. Wire fraud. The legal term refers to any scheme to defraud another person using electronic communications, including bank wire transfers. Under federal law, a single count carries up to 20 years in federal prison. 180 monthly transfers meant 180 potential counts. The sentencing exposure was not something I could hold in my head all at once, so I stopped trying. "Do not touch anything in that account," Robert said, and his voice had shifted into the register I recognized from 30 years of friendship, calm, precise, carrying the specific weight of a man who has just understood that something is very serious and has decided that the most useful thing he can do is be completely clear. "Do not transfer, do not withdraw, do not move a single dollar, do not call Eleanor tonight, do not contact the bank directly. Robert, not one move until I have looked at this myself." A brief pause. "Come to my office tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. Bring every piece of documentation you can pull tonight. Account statements, transfer records, everything." "I am also calling Marcus Holt tonight," Robert said. "The best investigator I have ever worked with. If there is a paper trail, Marcus will find it before anyone thinks to move it." "She planned this before I got on the plane," I said. "The account was already set up. The contact information was already in place. She did all of it before I left." "Yes," Robert said simply. He did not soften it because there was no version of it that was soft, and he knew me well enough to understand that I did not want one. "My daughter slept on the steps of a flower shop," I said. The words came out broken at the edges, rough and uneven. "She sold Diana's jewelry to pay debts she never created. And the whole time I was sitting on an oil platform in the North Sea, sending money home like a man who believed he was being a decent father." Robert was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Get what sleep you can," he said. "I will see you at 7. I hung up. I closed the laptop. The room went dark except for the strip of light under the bathroom door and the faint orange glow of the parking lot coming through the curtain gap. I sat at that desk with my hands flat on the surface in front of me and looked at nothing. Somewhere in the room next door, Sophie and Lily were sleeping in a motel bed, in a town that was not their home, in a life that was not the one I had spent 15 years believing I was building for them. I had wired the money. I had checked the confirmation. I had believed that was enough. It had not been nearly enough. I was at Robert's office by 6:15. The building on Commerce Street had been standing since the early 1980s, solid, slightly old-fashioned, the kind of place where the elevator moved slowly on purpose, and the oak furniture had never once been replaced, because replacing it would have meant admitting that something about the original choice had been wrong. Robert had worked out of the same 14th-floor suite for over 2 decades. Walking in felt the way it always had, like stepping into the office of a man who had seen enough of the world to stop being rattled by most of it. He was already at his desk. 2 mugs of coffee sat on the table between us, black, no sugar, the way we had both been drinking it since Fort Worth 30 years ago. He looked up when I walked in, and his eyes moved over me the way a doctor's eyes move, assessing, without commenting on what he found. "You didn't sleep," he said. "No. Sit down." He pushed one of the mugs toward me. "Marcus is on his way. Before he gets here, I want to tell you what I found last night." I sat and wrapped both hands around the mug. The heat of it burned my palms. I held on anyway. Robert opened a folder on his desk and turned it so I could read it right side up. Inside were printed pages, bank records, transaction logs, a corporate filing I did not immediately recognize. After we spoke, Robert said, "I called Marcus Holt. He is the investigator I mentioned, former LAPD, 12 years on the force, with his last 4 years running financial crimes cases. He has been in private practice for 8 years, and there is no one better in this city at following money that does not want to be followed." He tapped the first page. I gave him one question to start with: were there any financial connections between Eleanor and the family of Daniel Reeves? I leaned forward. Daniel Reeves was Sophie's former husband. I had met him twice before I left for the Gulf, a quiet man, careful with his words, the kind of person who seemed more comfortable listening than speaking. I had never entirely trusted the stillness in him, but I had attributed Sophie's unhappiness in that marriage to the ordinary friction of 2 people who had grown in different directions. I had not thought to look further. "What did Marcus find?" I asked. Robert tapped the first page of the folder. Over the past 3 years, Eleanor made a series of transfers to a personal checking account held by Daniel Reeves. 38 separate transactions. He slid the page toward me. Never more than $9,000 at a time. Always spaced several weeks apart. Always just under the federal reporting threshold. I looked at the column of numbers. My eyes moved to the total at the bottom. $74,000, I said. $74,260, Robert confirmed. He sat back in his chair and folded his hands on the desk with the deliberate patience of a man who has more to say and intends to say it in the right order. The amounts were kept deliberately below $10,000 per transaction. Under the Bank Secrecy Act, American financial institutions are legally required to file a currency transaction report for any cash transaction exceeding $10,000. By keeping each transfer just under that threshold, Eleanor avoided triggering an automatic report. That practice has a name under federal law structuring. It is a criminal offense under Title 31 of the United States Code Section 5324, entirely separate from the wire fraud charges. Structuring. The word landed in my chest with a dull, specific weight. It meant that the amounts had not been chosen carelessly. They had been calculated. Someone had sat down and worked out the exact number that would pool the maximum money while staying invisible to the systems designed to catch exactly this kind of behavior. "She thought of everything," I said. My voice came out lower than I intended. She thought of a great deal, Robert said carefully. But calculated people always make mistakes. And we are going to find every single one of them. The door to the office opened, and Marcus Holt walked in. He was 51 years old, broad-shouldered, with the compact, economical movements of a man who had spent years in rooms where stillness was a professional asset. His hair was cut close, his jacket was unremarkable, and his eyes were the kind of eyes that catalogued a room in the first 3 seconds and filed everything they found for later retrieval. He set a second folder on Robert's desk, pulled a chair up without being invited to, and looked at me directly. "Mr. Harmon," he said, "I have been up since 3. Let me tell you what I know." He did not waste a syllable. The $74,000 to Daniel's account was only the beginning. Marcus had pulled the corresponding bank records and traced where the money went after it landed. It did not stay in Daniel's account. Within 2 to 3 weeks of each deposit, it moved again to a vendor account for Daniel's small construction company, registered in Los Angeles County as Reeves Home Solutions. The company received 2 significant contracts over the past 3 years, Marcus said. Combined value just under $380,000. The contracting entity that awarded both jobs traces back through 2 holding companies. He paused. To a property management firm that Eleanor controls directly. I set my coffee mug down on the desk. Carefully. The way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady and you do not want to give that away. She paid him in contracts, I said. Indirect payments, Marcus said. Harder to trace than direct transfers. But the paper trail is there when you know where to look. He opened his folder to a second page. And now we know where to look. Robert leaned forward. What about the house on Birchwood Lane? Marcus looked at me. Mr. Harmon, when did you last speak directly to anyone at that property, not through Eleanor, but directly yourself? The question arrived like cold water thrown without warning. I opened my mouth and closed it again. In 15 years, I had never once called the house directly. I had emailed Eleanor. I had called Eleanor's cell phone. She had given me updates, brief, warm, exactly detailed enough to feel real. Sophie's doing well. Lily started 2nd grade. The water heater needed replacing. I took care of it. I had accepted every word because I had built my entire life overseas on the assumption that the people you trust will behave like people who deserve trust. I never did, I said slowly. Eleanor handled all communication. She managed everything. I felt something cold spreading through my chest, moving outward from the center, the way frost moves across glass when the temperature drops overnight. Robert, what did Marcus find about the house? Robert reached for the second folder and slid a single document across the desk toward me. I looked at it. My eyes moved to the line that listed the current owner of record for the property at Birchwood Lane. The name there was not Sophie's. My legs went unsteady beneath me and I gripped the edge of the desk with both hands. That house was never foreclosed on, Robert said quietly. It was transferred, and we need to find out exactly how and exactly when before we do anything else. Robert drove. I sat in the passenger seat and watched Los Angeles scroll past the window without really seeing any of it. I kept thinking about the morning I handed Sophie the keys to that house. She had been 24 years old, standing in the driveway on Birchwood Lane in the blue jacket Eleanor had bought her the previous spring, and she had looked at the keys in her palm like she was afraid to close her fingers around them in case they disappeared. I had told her the house was paid in full. No mortgage, no loan, no conditions attached. I wanted her to have one thing in this world that was entirely hers, one thing that no circumstance and no person could reach in and take away from her. I had been wrong about that in a way that still made my chest ache to think about directly. The Los Angeles County Property Records Office was a government building near the courthouse, beige walls, fluorescent lighting, the particular smell of paper that has been filed and retrieved and filed again for decades without anyone stopping to ask whether the system was working. A clerk led us into a research room and pulled the physical file for the property on Birchwood Lane without needing to be asked twice, which told me Robert had called ahead and used whatever tone he used when he needed things to move quickly. Robert spread the documents across the table. We went through them together, the original deed from when I purchased the property 16 years ago, the title, insurance, the tax records. All of it clean, all of it bearing my name and Sophie's name exactly as it should. Then Robert slid the next page in front of me. "This is the transfer document," he said. His voice had gone into that controlled register, the one that meant he was managing something tightly, and had decided that precision was more useful than any other response. "Filed 5 years ago, 8 months before the funeral in Singapore." I looked at it. It was a warranty deed, the standard legal instrument used in California property transfers. In California, a warranty deed is the most common form used to convey real property from one party to another. It includes a guarantee from the seller that they hold clear title and have the legal authority to complete the transfer. Without that authority, the deed is void. The grantor line read Richard James Harmon by power of attorney. The grantee line read Julian Voss. My eyes moved to the attached power of attorney document. It was a single page notarized with a signature at the bottom that was supposed to be mine. I looked at that signature for a long time. "That is not my signature," I said. Robert looked at me sharply. "You are certain?" It was not a question, but I answered it like one. "I have signed my name the same way for 40 years. The capital R in Richard I always closed the loop completely. It is a habit from grade school that I corrected myself on at age 9 and never changed back." I pressed my finger to the page just below the forged line. "This loop is open. Whoever did this was close, but not close enough." Robert pulled out his phone and began photographing every page, quick, precise movements, the efficiency of a man who had just identified something significant and was being very careful not to let himself feel it yet, because there was still work to do. "The notary stamp," I said, pointing to the seal at the bottom of the power of attorney. "How does someone get a notary to certify a document with a forged signature?" Robert straightened up. "A notary public in California is required by law to verify the identity of the person signing in their presence and to physically witness the signature being made. The signer must appear in person. The notary must confirm identity through valid government-issued identification." His expression hardened by a degree I had rarely seen from him. "But some notaries operating outside proper professional standards or operating for payment will certify documents without performing that verification. It is called notary fraud. Under California Penal Code Section 115, filing a forged or fraudulent document with a public office is a felony. The notary who stamped this document is potentially criminally liable alongside whoever forged the signature." "Julian Voss," I said. The name felt strange in my mouth. I had never spoken it aloud before, had never had reason to. "Who is he?" "That," Robert said, "is what Marcus is working on this morning." He tapped the commission record at the bottom of the transfer document. "What I can tell you right now is that Julian Voss is listed as the grantee, meaning Eleanor transferred the house into his name, not her own. That is not accidental. Putting it in her name directly would have created an obvious paper trail connecting her to the fraud. Putting it in his name adds a layer." I stepped back from the table. The room was very quiet. Fluorescent light hummed above us. Somewhere down the hall, a printer was running. I had bought that house outright, so Sophie would always have somewhere safe. I had pressed the keys into her hand in that driveway and told her this was hers, no conditions, no strings. And while I was sitting in a bare-walled apartment in Aberdeen wiring money home every month believing I was doing right by my family, someone had walked into this very office with a forged signature on a legal document and transferred my daughter's home into another person's name, 8 months before they held a funeral for me, which meant the house transfer had come first. Eleanor had taken Sophie's home before she took Sophie's father. She planned the sequence, I said. My voice came out shaking in a way I had not intended and could not stop. She moved the house first, then she staged the funeral. She needed Sophie to have nothing before she told her I was gone, so there would be nothing left to fight for. Robert put his hand on my shoulder. Brief, firm, the gesture of a man who had known me 30 years and understood that what I needed in that moment was not words or sympathy, but simple human contact to confirm that the ground was still solid. She made mistakes, he said quietly. Calculated people always do, and we are going to find every single one of them. My phone buzzed on the table. Marcus. I answered it. I have the notary's name, Marcus said without preamble. Raymond Colt's licensed California notary address in Burbank. His stamp appears on 3 other fraudulent property transfers in California over the past 6 years. He has been operating as a for-hire notary fraud service, certifying documents for cash without verifying identity or witnessing signatures. A pause. He charged Eleanor $800 for this one. I have the wire transfer record. $800. My daughter's home transferred out from under her for $800 paid to a man in Burbank who had made a career out of stamping lies. There is something else, Marcus said. Julian Voss is not Eleanor's son. I pulled his birth records. No biological connection. He has been operating alongside Eleanor for at least 11 years across 3 states. Different last names in 2 of them. Another pause. He is not family Richard. He is a partner. I looked at Robert across the table. Robert looked back at me with the steady, careful eyes of a man who was already thinking 3 steps ahead and had decided that thinking was more useful than reacting. Robert said. He used a different last name than Marcus had, and I filed that discrepancy away for later. Before we do, I want to know exactly what Marcus finds on his background. Because if Eleanor has been running this pattern for 11 years across 3 states, then what happened to Sophie was not improvised. He paused. It was practiced. That evening I went back to the flower shop, not to plan the next move, not to compare notes with Robert, or add another name to the growing list of things Eleanor had done. I went because I had spent the entire day reading property records and bank statements and legal documents, and all of those pages told me what had happened to my daughter in numbers and dates and terminology. But numbers and dates and terminology are not the same thing as the truth. The truth was sitting in the back room of a flower shop on a main street in a small town outside Los Angeles, and I needed to hear it from Sophie directly. He looked at me, looked at the door to the back room and said, Martha got here an hour ago. Fair warning, she has been crying since she walked in, and she is going to cry harder when she sees you. I know, I said. You want coffee? Please. He poured it without another word, and I carried it through the door. The back room was small, a work table, a cold storage unit humming against the far wall, shelves of ribbon and wire, and the particular smell of cut flowers that had been sitting in water all day. Sophie was at the table with both hands wrapped around a mug. Lily was on the floor against the wall, asleep, her coloring book open across her chest and a blue marker still loosely held in her right hand. Martha was standing in the corner. I had not seen my sister in 4 years. She was 62 now, silver-haired and sturdy built, like our mother had been built, wide shoulders, strong hands, the kind of face that showed every emotion it had ever processed, because she had never once in her life seen the point of hiding them. When she turned and saw me standing in the doorway, she made a sound I had never heard from her before. Something raw and completely unguarded that came from somewhere below language and crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed my arms with both hands and held on so hard I felt it in my bones. "You are real," she said into my shoulder. Her voice was wrecked. "You are actually standing here." "Richard, I went to the memorial. I sat in the front row and I held Sophie's hand and I cried for you, and you were on a rig somewhere eating dinner and I was—" She could not finish. Her whole body was shaking. "I know," I said. My throat was so tight the words barely made it out. "I know, Martha. I am so sorry." "Do not apologize." She pulled back and looked at my face with red, fierce eyes gripping my arms, like she was checking that I was solid. "Do not you dare apologize to me. Save it for Sophie." She released me, wiped her face with the back of her hand in one decisive motion, and stepped aside. Sophie was watching us from the table. She had been crying again, or still, the distinction had become difficult to track. But her jaw was set in that stubborn angle that meant she was holding herself together through sheer force of will and would continue to do so as long as she believed it was necessary. "Tell me everything," I said. "The 3 years, all of it." Sophie tightened her grip on the mug. She started with the debt letters. They had begun arriving about 3 years ago, statements from lenders she had never contacted, collection notices for accounts she had never opened. At first, she had assumed it was administrative error. She had called the numbers on the statements and explained calmly at first, and then less calmly, that she had not borrowed this money, that these accounts were not hers. "I went to Daniel," she said. "I showed him everything and asked him to help me understand what was happening." She paused. "He told me not to worry about it, that it was probably a clerical error and he would handle it." "He didn't handle it," I said. "He never touched it." And 3 weeks later, his mother called and said they needed me out of the house. Sophie's jaw tightened into a line I recognized, the same line Diana used to get when she had made a decision and was finished discussing it. I had nowhere to go, no money, no house. Daniel's company had a contract come through the week after I left. Brand new truck in the driveway 2 months later. Martha made a sharp sound from the corner that was not quite a word. "Then the letter came," Sophie said. She stopped on those 3 words and looked at the table. "What letter?" I said, though something in the way she said it made the back of my neck go cold. "About 8 months after the funeral." Sophie looked up at me. Her eyes were steady in the way that steady can mean the pain has been examined so many times it has gone smooth. "It was handwritten. On your stationery, Dad. The blue paper with your initials at the top that you had printed before you left. Eleanor said she found it in your desk when she was going through your things." My hands went flat on the work table. "The letter said—" Sophie continued, her voice dropping to something barely above a breath. "That you had been watching from a distance. That you were disappointed in the choices I had made. That I had not been the wife or the mother or the daughter you had hoped I would be." She stopped, swallowed. "It said you had made arrangements to ensure that your estate went to someone who had, in your words, actually taken care of things." The room was so quiet I could hear the cold storage unit humming. "That was not mine," I said. The words came out with a force I had not intended. "Sophie, I never wrote those words. Not one of them. I have never been disappointed in you, not for a single day of your life." Sophie's chin trembled once, just once. Then she set her jaw and held it. "I know that now," she said. "But I didn't know it then. I read it 4 times, Dad. I kept it in my nightstand for months. Every time I started to feel angry about what was happening, the debts Daniel the house, I would take it out and read it again and tell myself I must have done something to deserve all of it." Martha stepped forward and put both hands on Sophie's shoulders from behind, gripping them hard. "She burned it eventually," Martha said, her voice rough. "She called me the night she did it. She was standing in the backyard with a match, and she said she was letting go." Martha's jaw worked hard against something. I thought she was healing. I did not know she was burning evidence. I reached across the table and took Sophie's hands in both of mine. They were ice cold. "I wrote you one letter," I said. "6 years ago, the morning I flew out to the Gulf rig. I left it on the kitchen counter and asked Eleanor to make sure you got it." I tightened my grip on her hands. "Did you ever receive it?" Sophie looked at me for a long moment. "No," she said quietly. "I never did." Sophie reached into her coat pocket and set a phone on the work table between us. It was an older model, not hers, I could tell by the case, a plain black rectangle with a crack across the lower left corner that had been there long enough to become unremarkable. She pushed it toward me without explanation, the way you push something toward a person when you have been waiting a long time to hand it over and have not yet decided how to frame what comes next. "2 years ago," she said, "I received a phone call." Martha had pulled her chair closer to Sophie's and was sitting with one hand resting on her niece's forearm, not gripping. Just present the particular touch of someone who has learned that sometimes the most useful thing you can offer another person is the warmth of your hand on their skin. "The number was blocked," Sophie continued. "But the voice—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "The voice was yours, Dad. Exactly yours. The way you say my name when something is serious, that slight drop on the second syllable. The way you clear your throat before you say something difficult. The way you breathe." She looked at me steadily. "It knew things that only you would know. It asked me about the yellow kite, the one you and I flew on the beach at Santa Monica the summer I was 11 years old. Mom got sunburned and we stayed out until the kite string snapped and we lost it over the water. My chest had gone so tight it was difficult to draw a full breath." "What did the voice say?" I asked. Sophie looked at the phone on the table rather than at me. "It said you had been watching from a distance, that you were proud of me but that the situation with the estate had become complicated, that Eleanor was managing everything correctly, and that the best thing I could do for you, for Lily, for everyone, was to sign a document releasing any claim I had to your estate so that the lawyers could close the file cleanly." She paused. "It said it was the last thing you were going to ask of me. The last thing you were going to ask of me." I stood up from my chair because sitting still while absorbing that felt physically impossible. I walked to the far wall and stood there with both hands pressed flat against the cold surface and breathed through my nose until I trusted myself to speak again. "And you signed it," I said. I kept my voice level. I kept it level because Sophie did not need my rage on top of everything she was already carrying. "A courier arrived the next morning," Sophie said. "Official-looking envelope. The document inside looked like a standard legal release. I read it 3 times. I called the number back, and the same voice confirmed it was correct." She stopped. "I signed it, Dad. I signed away any claim to your estate because I thought I was honoring your last wish." Martha made a sound beside her that was barely contained fury wrapped in grief. I turned back from the wall. "Play it," I said. Sophie unlocked the phone and opened a voice memo application. She pressed play and set it face up on the table between us. The audio was clear, no background noise. Professional quality, the kind of clarity you get when a recording has been produced deliberately rather than captured accidentally. And then I heard my voice. Except, it was not my voice. It was a reconstruction of my voice, every inflection, every cadence, every particular rhythm of the way I form sentences assembled from recordings, and rebuilt into something that could pass for the real thing, in the dark on a phone to a grieving daughter who had already been told her father was dead, and had no reason to question a voice she recognized calling from beyond that grief. It knew about the yellow kite. It knew about the summer at Santa Monica. It knew the way I say Sophie's name. When the recording ended, I stood completely still for approximately 30 seconds. Then I picked up my own phone and called Robert. He answered on the second ring. "I need you to listen to something," I said. "Right now." I held my phone next to Sophie's and played the recording again. Robert did not speak until it had finished. "Send me that file tonight," he said. His voice was absolutely controlled. "I am calling a forensic audio analyst I have worked with before, and I am going to need Marcus on this first thing tomorrow morning." "What are we looking at?" I asked. "What you are looking at," Robert said carefully, "is AI-generated voice cloning. The technology exists. It has existed at a commercially accessible level since approximately 2022. A company called 11 Labs made it widely available. For a few $100s, a person can upload audio samples of a target's voice and generate new speech in that voice saying anything they choose. He paused. In California, the use of AI-generated voice or likeness to deceive another person into signing a legal document is addressed under Assembly Bill 602, signed into law in 2023. It is a civil violation with significant damages exposure. Combined with the wire fraud and forgery charges we are already building, this adds another count. I looked at Sophie across the table. She was watching me with the expression of a person who has been carrying a specific shame for 2 years, the shame of having been deceived, and is watching that shame be reclassified in real time as something that was done to her rather than something she allowed. "Sophie," I said. I sat back down and leaned forward so she had to look directly at me. "That document you signed is not valid. A signature obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation, including impersonation, is voidable under California contract law. It means the document can be challenged and set aside entirely. You did not give anything away. It was taken from you." Her chin trembled. She pressed both hands flat on the table and held herself together with visible effort. "How did she get recordings of your voice?" Martha asked. Her voice had gone very quiet and very precise, the voice she used when she was furious, and had decided that precision was more dangerous than volume. "She lived with me for 3 years, I said. "Every phone call I made from the house, every video message I recorded for Sophie, every dinner table conversation." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. She had years of material. All she needed was someone who knew how to use it. "The document the courier brought," Sophie said. She looked up at me. "If it is not valid, what about the house? What about everything else she had me sign?" It was the right question. It was exactly the right question, and the fact that Sophie was asking it with clear eyes and a steady voice instead of falling apart told me something about my daughter that I had not had the chance to learn in 15 years of absence. She had survived all of this, and she was still thinking. "That I said is what Robert is going to help us answer tomorrow morning." Sophie nodded once. She reached across the table and picked up the phone with the cracked case and held it in both hands for a moment. "I kept the recording because something felt wrong," she said quietly. "Even then. Even when I believed it was you." She set the phone back down. "Your voice said all the right words, but it never once asked how I was doing." Marcus Holt was already at Robert's office when I arrived at 7 the following morning. I knew that before I opened the door because the light under it was on, and I could hear 2 voices, Robert's measured and unhurried, Marcus's clipped and direct, moving through something with the focused efficiency of men who had been working for several hours and had reached the part where the picture was becoming clear. I pushed the door open, and Marcus looked up from the folder spread across Robert's desk and said without preamble or greeting, "Sit down. There is a lot." He was right about that. Marcus Holt had spent 12 years with the Los Angeles Police Department, the last 4 running financial crimes investigations out of the Robbery Homicide Division's Economic Crimes Unit. He had the particular stillness of a man who had spent a career in rooms where the wrong word at the wrong moment could collapse a case, and he had learned to treat every syllable as something that needed to earn its place before it was allowed out. He was 51 years old and looked it in the best possible way, a face that had processed a significant amount of human behavior and arrived at something that was not cynicism but was very close to its more useful cousin. He opened the folder to the first page and turned it so I could read it. "Her real name is Eleanor Cross," he said. "Or it was 22 years ago. Before Los Angeles, before Phoenix, before she became the woman you married, she was operating out of Austin, Texas under that name." I kept my hands flat on my knees and said nothing. I had learned in the past 2 days that the most useful thing I could do when Marcus was delivering information was stay completely still and let him deliver it. 22 years ago, Marcus continued, a civil fraud complaint was filed in Travis County, Texas against a woman matching Eleanor's description. The complainant was the adult daughter of a wealthy widower in Austin. The father, recently bereaved, living alone, had met a woman named Eleanor Cross through a church social group. Within 14 months, she had moved into the family home. Within 3 years, approximately $420,000 in assets had moved from the father's accounts into accounts she controlled. Robert leaned forward. How was it discovered? The daughter hired a forensic accountant when the father's estate attorney flagged irregular transfers. By the time they understood the full scope, Eleanor Cross had already begun moving assets out of state. Marcus turned to the next page. The family filed a civil complaint. Eleanor's attorney negotiated a settlement. She repaid a fraction of what she had taken, signed a non-disclosure agreement, and the case was sealed. Then she disappeared from Texas entirely. I pressed both fists against the edge of the desk. $420,000. A widower. A daughter who had watched her father be systematically stripped of everything while she tried to understand what was happening and found herself 2 steps behind at every turn. I knew exactly what that felt like. She changed her name within 18 months of the settlement, Marcus said. Eleanor Cross became Eleanor Voss. She relocated to Phoenix, Arizona, where she remained for several years before moving to Los Angeles. He paused and looked at me directly. Richard, you were not the second person she did this to. You were at minimum the third. The room felt smaller than it had 60 seconds ago. She practiced on other families, I said. My voice came out hollow and controlled, the voice I used when the alternative was something I could not afford in Robert's office at 7 in the morning. She refined the method. She got better at it. The Texas case tells us she has been operating this way for over 2 decades, Robert said. He picked up his pen. Under Rule 404B of the Federal Rules of Evidence, a prosecutor can introduce evidence of prior bad acts to establish a pattern of behavior and demonstrate intent. It is not admissible simply to show that she is generally a bad person. But it is admissible to show that this conduct targeting bereaved individuals, building fraudulent financial structures, changing identities to escape consequences, is a deliberate and repeated pattern. He looked at me steadily. This changes the sentencing exposure significantly. There is more, Marcus said. He turned to a third page. The $3.5 million Richard transferred over 15 years did not sit in the fraudulent account. Eleanor moved it, systematically over time in increments designed to avoid triggering automatic monitoring systems. He tapped the page. She converted the funds to cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, through a series of 3 intermediate wallet addresses. Each conversion was timed to coincide with periods of high transaction volume on the network, which makes individual transfers harder to isolate. The final destination was a corporate account at a private bank in the Cayman Islands, held under the name of a shell company Julian Voss controls. Cryptocurrency, money laundering works precisely because blockchain transactions, while technically public, are pseudonymous, meaning they are tied to wallet addresses rather than legal identities. Tracing them requires matching wallet addresses to real-world identities through exchange records and subpoenas, a process that takes time and specialized expertise. Eleanor had used that complexity deliberately. "The Cayman account," Robert said. "Can it be frozen?" "That," Marcus said, "is why I made a phone call at 5:30 this morning." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card. He set it on the desk, face up. Special Agent Sarah Jenkins, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Unit, Los Angeles Field Office. "Sarah Jenkins has been building a file on Eleanor Voss for 4 years, Marcus said. "She has had the pattern, the name changes, the target profile, the financial structure, but she has never had a victim willing to go on record with documented losses large enough to justify a federal indictment." He looked at me. "Until now." Robert's phone buzzed on the desk. He looked at the screen and held it up so I could see it. "Incoming call, Sarah Jenkins, FBI." Robert answered on speaker. The voice that came through was clear and unhurried. A woman in her mid-40s, I guessed, with the particular cadence of someone who had learned to deliver complicated information without editorial commentary, because the facts were sufficient on their own. "Mr. Harmon," Agent Jenkins said, "I have been waiting 4 years for this phone call. I want you to know that within 48 hours of receiving the account documentation from Mr. Holt, I can have a freeze order on the Cayman account. Eleanor Voss will not be able to move a single dollar." A pause. "But I need everything you have. Every transfer record, every document, every piece of correspondence. And I need it today." "You will have it by noon," Robert said. "There is one more thing," Agent Jenkins said. Her voice shifted slightly, the shift of a person about to deliver information they have been sitting on and have decided the moment has arrived to release. "We ran Eleanor Voss through our interstate fraud database this morning. The Texas case you have already found. But there is a third case, a civil matter in Phoenix sealed under a different name. The victim in that case is still alive. She is 71 years old, and she has been waiting 11 years for someone to call her." I looked at Robert across the desk. Robert looked back at me with the expression he wore when the information he had just received was worse than expected, and he had already decided that the only useful response was to keep moving forward. "Get her number," I said. I did not tell Robert I was going. Not because I was hiding it from him. Robert had known me 30 years, and hiding things from him was a project that had never once succeeded. But because there are conversations a lawyer cannot have on a client's behalf, and this was one of them. What I needed from Daniel Reeves was not a deposition. It was not a sworn statement or a signed affidavit or anything that needed to be handled with procedural precision. What I needed was to look at the man who had sat across a kitchen table from my daughter while she showed him debt collection letters she did not understand, told her not to worry, and then cashed a check from the woman who had created those debts. I needed to look at him and understand what I was dealing with. Marcus had the address. I drove out to Mesquite in the late afternoon, the October sun dropping fast behind the San Gabriel Mountains, the freeway thinning as I moved east of downtown. The apartment complex was the kind that exists in every mid-sized city in America, 3 stories of beige stucco, assigned parking, a leasing office with a laminated sign in the window advertising move-in specials. The kind of place a person lands when things have not gone the way they planned, and they are waiting to see if they are going to get back on track or stay here. Daniel Reeves answered the door on the second knock. He was 37 years old and looked older. Shorter hair than I remembered from the 2 times I had met him before I left. He had worn it longer. Then the easy look of a man in his late 20s who had not yet started keeping track of what the years were doing to him. The lines around his eyes had deepened. He had the particular hollowness of a man who had been living with something uncomfortable for long enough that it had started to show in his face the way water shows in limestone slowly, then all at once. He looked at me and went completely still. Not surprised. Braced. The expression of a person who has been waiting for an unpleasant knock and has finally heard it arrive. "Mr. Harmon," he said. "10 minutes," I said. "That is all I am asking." He stepped back and let me in. The apartment was sparse in the way that suggested not minimalism, but absence furniture chosen for function. Nothing on the walls except one thing. On the refrigerator, held in place by a magnet shaped like the state of California, was a child's drawing in blue marker. A house, 2 figures, a sun in the upper right corner. In the lower left, in the careful block letters of a child who had recently learned to write her own name, Lily. That detail cost me something I had not expected to spend in this room. I sat at the kitchen table. Daniel sat across from me and folded his hands on the surface between us and looked at them rather than at me. Outside, someone in the parking lot was starting a truck that needed a new muffler. The sound of it filled the silence and then faded. "You knew," I said. "Not everything, but enough." Not. He did not deny it. His jaw tightened. He exhaled slowly through his nose, and the exhale had the quality of something that had been held in for a long time and was finally being let go, whether he wanted it to be or not. "I knew money was coming from Eleanor," he said. His voice was hollow, stripped of whatever professional composure he had probably rehearsed. "She framed it as a family arrangement, said she was managing your estate and that part of the proceeds needed to flow through a legitimate business entity for tax purposes." He stopped. I told myself I believed her. "But you didn't," I said. He looked up at me then. His eyes were red at the rims. "I had questions I chose not to ask," he said. "That is a very different thing from believing her, and I know that. My daughter came to you with letters from debt collectors she had never heard of," I said. I kept my voice level and quiet because anger lets people off too easily. It gives them something to push back against, and that was not what I wanted from Daniel Reeves. "She showed you accounts in her name that she had never opened. She asked you to help her understand what was happening, and you told her it was probably a clerical error, and then you did nothing." The first tear moved down his face. He wiped it with the back of his hand quickly, the gesture of a man who was ashamed of crying, and more ashamed of what he was crying about. "She loved you," I said. "Sophie loved you through all of it. She sold everything her mother left her, trying to hold your family together. And you sat across this table from her and told her not to worry." Daniel pressed both fists against the table. His shoulders shook once, just once, and then he locked it down with visible effort and raised his head. "When I found out she was buying plane tickets," he said, "I understood what I was." He said it flatly, without self-pity, the way a person states a fact they have arrived at through painful calculation. "She was not taking me with her. I was never part of the exit plan. I was a mechanism, a legitimate business entity for routing money through exactly like she said, except I was not a business entity, I was a person, and she had never once considered the difference." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a USB drive on the table between us. It was small, no larger than my thumbnail silver, completely unremarkable. "Everything she sent me," he said. "Every email, every text message, every wire instruction. 2 phone calls I recorded myself when I started to understand what was happening. Time-stamped. The calls are from 18 months ago when the contracts started coming through, and I began asking questions she did not want to answer. He looked at the drive rather than at me. I kept it because I did not know what else to do with it, and because I was afraid. I picked up the drive and held it in my palm. "A voluntary statement to Robert Caldwell's office," I said. "Everything you just told me on record. Everything on this drive turned over completely with a full chain of custody documentation, so it is admissible. That is what this is worth." He nodded once, the nod of a man who has made a decision and is not going to revisit it. "Whatever the process requires," he said, "I will not fight it." I stood and walked to the door. I stopped with my hand on the frame and looked back at him once. "For what it is worth, Daniel, what you did has a name under California law. Conspiracy to commit fraud, Section 182 of the Penal Code. What you are doing right now is the only reason a prosecutor would consider anything other than the maximum exposure." I held his gaze. "Do not waste it." I walked out into the October evening and stood on the walkway with the drive pressed against my palm and thought about a little girl who had drawn a house in blue marker and written her name in the corner, and whose father had kept it on his refrigerator for reasons that were complicated and human and not entirely without worth. Then I called Robert. "He gave us everything," I said. "Before I reveal the final courtroom showdown and how I brought her down, comment still here right now so I know you are following this journey, and please be advised, the upcoming events contain dramatized elements that may not match exact court records. If you prefer not to listen further, you are welcome to close the video here." Robert drove again. He had said very little since I called him from the parking lot outside Daniel's apartment the previous evening, which told me he was thinking hard. Robert Caldwell at full volume was a formidable thing. Robert Caldwell gone quiet was something else entirely. It meant the machinery was running at a level that did not leave capacity for speech, and the output, when it came, was invariably worth waiting for. He broke the silence somewhere on the 101 heading into Uptown. "Julian Voss has a California real estate broker's license," he said. "He has held it for 19 years. He has processed over 400 transactions in Los Angeles County." He did not take his eyes off the freeway. A man with that much experience does not accidentally fail to verify a power of attorney on a property transfer. He knew what he was looking at. He made a choice. "How much did he get?" I asked. $15,000, Robert said, "wired to a personal account 3 days before the transaction closed." 3 days before, not after. Before, which meant the payment was not a fee for services rendered, but a payment for services about to be rendered, made at the moment when Julian Voss had reviewed the documents and confirmed to Eleanor that yes, he could make this work. Julian Voss's office was on a street in uptown LA, where the storefronts were all glass and brushed steel, and the parking was validated only if you were spending money inside. The reception area smelled like new carpet and expensive coffee. A young woman at the front desk looked up when we entered and reached for her phone, but Robert had called ahead, in terms that made hesitation seem unwise, and Julian was already waiting for us in the conference room. He was in his late 40s, well-dressed in the careful way of a man who understood that appearance was a form of professional communication. Dark blazer, open collar, the kind of groomed confidence that came from 2 decades of making other people feel that transactions were proceeding smoothly, and that he was the reason why. He stood when we entered and extended his hand with a smile that was practiced and immediate and did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Caldwell," he said. "Mr. Harmon." He gestured to the chairs across the conference table. "Please." Robert sat. I sat. Robert opened his briefcase. He placed the documents on the table one at a time, And he did it slowly, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who understood that the sequence mattered. The warranty deed first, then the power of attorney with the forged signature, then the broker commission record with Julian's license number printed clearly at the bottom, then the notary fraud documentation, then the visitor log from the building on McKinney Avenue, a handwritten entry 4 years and 8 months ago, Julian's name signed in the column beside Eleanor's. Then Robert placed one final document on top of the others. A bank record. A wire transfer of $15,000 from an account held by Eleanor Voss to a personal account held by Julian Voss, dated 3 days before the Birchwood Lane transaction closed. Julian looked at the bank record. The practiced smile did not disappear all at once. It faded the way light fades when a cloud moves across the sun, gradually, and then completely until the room felt different without it. "That was a consulting fee," he said. His voice had thinned by a degree that he could not quite control. "Julian." Robert's tone was not unkind. It was absolute. "We have the forged power of attorney. We have the notary fraud documentation. Raymond Colts in Burbank has already provided a full statement identifying you as the broker who retained his services. We have a visitor log placing you at Richard Harmon's former office building, alongside Eleanor Voss, 1 month before the deed was executed." He leaned forward by a single inch. "That visit establishes premeditation. You were not presented with documents after the fact and asked to process them. You were involved in the preparation." Julian's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been resting flat on the conference table with professional stillness, curled slightly at the fingers. "Under California Business and Professions Code, Section 10176, Robert continued, "a licensed real estate broker who knowingly participates in a fraudulent property transaction faces license revocation, civil liability, and referral for criminal prosecution. The broker of record on a fraudulent transfer who received $15,000 3 days before closing is not a peripheral figure in these proceedings." He paused. "How peripheral or central you appear will depend entirely on what you do in the next 10 minutes. Julian sat very still. Outside the conference room window, uptown LA went about its afternoon business coffee shops and ride shares and people walking fast with their phones in their hands, entirely indifferent to the fact that a man in a dark blazer was sitting 3 floors above them, deciding what the rest of his life was going to look like. His shoulders dropped a fraction. He set his pen down on the table with a small, deliberate click. He pressed both palms flat on the surface and looked at them. "She came to me with everything already prepared," he said. His voice was quiet now, stripped of its professional finish. "The power of attorney, the deed, the supporting identification. She said it was a family matter, that her husband had authorized the transfer and was working overseas and could not attend closing in person." He stopped. "I asked for secondary identification. She had it. The documents looked correct on their face." He looked up at me then. Not at Robert. At me. "I have been doing this for 19 years, he said. "I know what a clean transaction feels like. This one did not feel clean." His jaw tightened. "But I had $15,000 in my account, and a file that appeared legal, and I told myself it was a family matter that was not my business to adjudicate." I looked at him across the conference table. This man who had processed 400 legitimate transactions, and then looked at one fraudulent one and chosen the $15,000 over the question that was sitting right in front of him. "My daughter slept in a storage room behind a flower shop," I said. My voice was very quiet. "She sold her dead mother's jewelry to pay debts she never created. And you looked at a file that did not feel clean and decided it was not your business." Julian did not look away. He took that in with his eyes open. "What do you need from me?" he said. "A full written statement," Robert said. Everything she told you, everything she showed you, the exact circumstances of the payment. Signed, notarized, and delivered to my office by 9 tomorrow morning. My license, Julian said. The two words came out flat, carrying the weight of 19 years. Almost certainly, Robert said. But a voluntary statement given before charges are filed carries weight that testimony compelled by subpoena does not. This is the better path. It is the only one that gives you any meaningful control over what comes next. Julian pulled a legal pad toward him. His hands were shaking now, the real ones underneath 19 years of professional composure. He picked up his pen and began to write. I walked to the window while Robert guided him through the statement. Below on the street, the afternoon moved at its ordinary, indifferent pace. When Julian finished signing, Robert capped his pen and closed his briefcase. In the elevator going down, he said nothing for a moment. Then he made a small sound, not quite satisfaction, not quite relief, but something that lived between the two. Marcus called while you were parking this morning, he said. He found something about Eleanor's history that predates Texas. He glanced at me. Her name was not always Eleanor Richard, and Texas was not the first time. The elevator doors opened. I stepped out into the October air and thought about a woman who had walked into this building 4 years ago with Julian Voss beside her and a forged signature in her hand. And I understood, for the first time, that what had happened to my family had not begun with me. Marcus was waiting at Robert's office when we got back. He had 2 laptops open on the conference table, his own, and a second one he had borrowed from somewhere, both screens angled so they could be seen from the chairs across the table. He did not stand when we walked in. He looked up, registered that we were both still functional, and said, "Close the door." Robert closed it. "I need to show you 2 things," Marcus said. "The order matters. The first one is going to make you angry. The second one is going to make you angrier. I need you to get through both of them before you react to either." I pulled out a chair and sat down. "Go ahead," I said. Marcus turned the first laptop to face us. On the screen was an Instagram profile. The account name was printed in clean sans serif font. At the top, Diana's Legacy. The profile photograph was one I recognized, a candid shot of Diana at a garden party, laughing at something outside the frame, her hair loose. The afternoon light catching the silver in it, the way it always had in photographs taken outdoors. She had been 51 years old in that picture. It had been taken 2 years before she got sick. I had not seen that photograph in 14 years. The account had 340,000 followers. Eleanor created this account approximately 2 years ago, Marcus said. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man delivering information he finds personally repugnant, and has decided that professional detachment is the only responsible way to handle it. The stated mission of the account is supporting immigrant working families who have been, and I am quoting directly here, abandoned by the system and left to rebuild alone. She used Diana's photograph, I said. My voice came out very quiet. She used Diana's photograph, Diana's name, and a version of your family's story that she had rewritten to position herself as the devoted widow who had stepped in to hold everything together after your death. Marcus tapped the trackpad, and the screen scrolled down through posts, photographs of Diana, captions, written in the warm, confessional tone of someone sharing their grief journey with strangers who had chosen to follow it. The account generated $180,000 in direct donations over 22 months. The money was routed through a payment processor to an account Eleanor controlled. Not $1 was distributed to any charitable cause. Robert had gone very still beside me. In 30 years, I had seen Robert Caldwell angry twice. Both times it had looked like this, a quality of absolute stillness, every resource pulled inward, nothing wasted on the surface. The Federal Trade Commission, Robert said, his voice precise and clipped, has explicit regulations governing charitable solicitation conducted through social media platforms. Misrepresenting the purpose of a fundraising campaign and diverting donated funds is fraud under both federal and California state law. The amounts involved here are sufficient for felony classification. He paused. Add it to the indictment. Marcus turned the second laptop toward us. It showed a property listing. Photographs of a house I knew, the porch, the oak tree in the front yard, the kitchen with the window that looked out onto the backyard where Diana had kept a garden. The listing was on a short-term rental platform, professionally photographed, priced at $430 per night. The property address was Birchwood Lane. Julian Voss listed the house on the platform 14 months after the transfer was completed, Marcus said. I looked at the photographs on the screen. The living room, the hallway, the bedroom where Sophie had slept for years. All of it photographed with the clean, depersonalized aesthetic of a rental property, throw pillows chosen for color rather than comfort, a coffee maker that had never belonged to anyone. And then I saw it. In the background of the kitchen photograph, barely visible in the lower right corner, hung a framed picture on the wall beside the refrigerator. The resolution was not high enough to make out the faces clearly, but I knew the dimensions of that frame. I had chosen it myself from a shop on Melrose Avenue the year Sophie turned 5. I knew what was inside it. Diana, me, Sophie at 5 years old in a yellow dress standing between us in the backyard on a Sunday afternoon, squinting into the sun and grinning with the complete, uncomplicated happiness of a child who has not yet learned that happiness is something you can lose. Eleanor had left that photograph on the wall, not because she forgot it, because she had kept it there deliberately in the kitchen of the house she had stolen as wallpaper, as decoration. As a piece of the family she had dismantled, repurposed, to make the space feel lived in for strangers who paid $430 a night and left reviews about the charming neighborhood and the comfortable beds. I stood up from the chair. I walked to the window and stood there, with both hands pressed flat against the glass, and looked out at the street below and breathed. 1 breath, 2, 3, 4. The kind of deliberate breathing you do when what is moving through you is too large to process through ordinary channels, and you need to give it somewhere to go that is not the room you are standing in. Richard, Robert said quietly. Give me a minute, I said. He gave me the minute. When I turned back from the window, my jaw ached from how hard I had been holding it. But I was steady. I had decided to be steady, and I was going to remain so because there was still work to do, and falling apart in Robert's conference room was not going to help my daughter. The rental income, I said. Does it trace back to the Cayman account? Through 2 intermediate accounts, Marcus said. Yes. So, the same pipeline, I said. Everything goes to the same place. Everything goes to the same place, Marcus confirmed. Robert made a note on his legal pad. The scratch of his pen on paper was the only sound in the room for a moment. There is something else Sophie needs to know, Marcus said. He looked at me carefully, the way he looked when he was about to say something he had been deciding how to frame. She already knows about the listing. She found it herself 6 months ago. A friend sent her the link. I looked at him. She recognized the house from the photographs, Marcus continued. She saw the kitchen. She saw the photograph on the wall. He stopped. She called me that night. She had gotten my number from Martha, and she told me she had pulled up the listing on her phone and sat with it for 2 hours before she could put it down. He paused. She said the hardest part was the reviews. Guests writing about what a wonderful, warm home it felt like. What a special place. The room was very quiet. She never told me any of that, I said. She did not want to add to what you were already carrying, Marcus said simply. I thought about Sophie finding that listing on her phone in the back room of a flower shop, recognizing her childhood home in a rental photograph, seeing her family's picture used as decor, sitting with it alone for 2 hours before she called anyone. She had been protecting me. My daughter, who had lost everything, had found the thing that broke her and then put it away so it would not break me. Patricia Vance called this afternoon, Robert said from behind his legal pad. He looked up at me. She is Lily's teacher. She says there is something about a scholarship we need to hear. Patricia Vance arrived at the flower shop at 9 the following morning. She was 38 years old, compact and direct, with the particular kind of energy that good elementary school teachers carry, the energy of someone who has spent years learning to hold 20 different children's realities simultaneously without losing track of any of them. She had driven 40 minutes from her school in the valley, and she had brought a manila folder under one arm, and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for permission to say something for a very long time, and had finally decided that permission was not something she was going to wait for any longer. He had developed a sixth sense over the past several days for when the back room needed to be available, and he deployed it without commentary or ceremony, the way he did most useful things. Sophie and I were already at the work table. Martha had taken Lily to a park 2 blocks away, an arrangement that had been made quietly, without explanation, because Martha understood, before any of us said it aloud, that whatever Patricia Vance had come to say was not something Lily needed to be in the room for. Patricia set her folder on the table and looked at me with clear, steady eyes. "I have been Lily's teacher for 2 years," she said. "I want you to know what that has looked like." "Please," I said, "tell me everything." She told me. Lily had come to her class in September of the previous year, wearing a shirt with a fraying collar, that she had repaired herself with a safety pin, small, careful stitches that a child had made with her tongue, pressed to the corner of her mouth, trying to fix something she did not yet have the resources to replace. She arrived early every morning, not because she was eager though she was, but because the school building was warm and consistent in a way that her living situation was not. She did her homework in the library during lunch because the common areas were too loud for the kind of concentration her work required. She never complained. She never asked for anything that was not strictly necessary. She is one of the 3 most naturally gifted students I have taught in 14 years, Patricia said, without hesitation or qualification. She reads 2 full grade levels above her peers. Her mathematical reasoning is exceptional. She asks questions that take me a moment to answer, which does not happen often. She opened the folder. 8 months ago, I nominated her for the Hargrove Educational Foundation Scholarship, $8,000 annually renewable through high school. It covers enrichment programs, academic supplies, and a summer camp at UCLA. She was the strongest candidate in the applicant pool by a significant margin. I was certain she would receive it. "But she didn't," Sophie said. Her voice was very quiet. "She was removed from the finalist list 6 weeks before the award was announced," Patricia said. Her jaw tightened. The official reason given was residential instability. Her address of record had been flagged in the foundation's screening system due to credit-related alerts associated with the household's specifically outstanding debt linked to Sophie's Social Security number, the fraudulent debt. The accounts Eleanor had opened in Sophie's name 3 years ago. The same debt Sophie had been fighting since the first collection letter arrived, the same debt that had driven her to sell her car and her furniture and every piece of jewelry Diana had ever given her. That debt had followed Sophie out of Los Angeles, found her in a small town where she had gone to disappear, and used itself to reach into her daughter's future and close a door. "There is something else," Patricia said. Her voice dropped slightly. Eleanor Voss was a contributing donor to the Hargrove Foundation. At the donor level she had a seat on the Scholarship Review Committee. She paused, letting that land. I was present at the committee meeting where Lily's file was discussed. I cannot prove she specifically targeted the application, but the residential instability flag was raised immediately and forcefully, and it did not require persuasion to carry the vote. Sophie made a sound beside me that was barely audible, a single sharp exhale, as though something had struck her in the chest. She knew Lily was applying, Sophie said. She knew because I told Daniel about it. I was so proud. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together hard. I told Daniel, and she would have known within the day. I reached across the table and covered Sophie's hand with mine. Patricia continued. When I told Lily the scholarship had been awarded to another student, she looked at her desk for a moment. Then she looked up at me and asked if she could still use the school library on Saturdays to study. I said, of course. Patricia's voice went quieter. She asked if I knew where she could find math books that went further than what we covered in class. She stopped. I bought them myself. I did not tell her that. The room held that sentence for a moment. An 8-year-old girl just told she had lost an $8,000 scholarship asking about extra math books. Not crying, not asking why. Asking about math books. Marcus confirmed something this morning, I said. I kept my voice steady because Sophie was watching my face and taking her cues from it, and I needed her to stay with me. Eleanor did not stop at the scholarship. Patricia looked at me. About a year before the scholarship interference, I said, Eleanor filed a petition with the Los Angeles County Probate Court seeking conservatorship over Sophie. She submitted a psychological evaluation from a licensed therapist, concluding that Sophie was experiencing severe anxiety disorder that rendered her incapable of managing her own legal and financial affairs. Sophie turned to look at me sharply. I knew about the evaluation, she said. A therapist contacted me for a session. I thought it was a county referral program. I answered her questions. I did not know there was a report. The report was prepared and filed without your knowledge or consent, I said. Under California Probate Code Section 1801, a conservatorship petition requires a court hearing where the subject has the right to legal representation and the right to contest the findings. Daniel attended that hearing and contested the petition on your behalf. The court denied it 6 months later. I paused. But during those 6 months, Eleanor used the pending petition as grounds to argue that Sophie lacked legal standing to challenge any of the property or financial transactions conducted on her behalf. Patricia had gone very still. She tried to have Sophie declared legally incompetent, Patricia said. She did not phrase it as a question. She was putting it together in real time, and the picture assembling itself in her expression was the picture of a woman who worked every day with children and understood at a visceral level exactly what it meant to be targeted by someone who operated without limits. She did, I said. And when that failed, she went after Lily's scholarship instead. Sophie was not crying. She was past crying for this particular pain. She had processed it alone in the months before I arrived in the way she had processed everything. What was in her face now was something harder and more useful than grief. It was the expression of a woman who has finally been handed the full picture of what was done to her and is deciding clearly and deliberately what she is going to do with that information. Patricia, I said, would you be willing to provide a formal statement about what you observed at the scholarship committee meeting? I drove 40 minutes this morning, she said, to make sure you knew what I had seen. Yes, I will say whatever needs to be said. She looked at Sophie. Whatever helps Lily. She stood, shook our hands, and left the folder on the table. I listened to her footsteps disappear down the hallway, and then I sat in the quiet of the back room and looked at my daughter. Sophie looked back at me. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were clear. "What is next?" she said. Before I could answer, Kevin appeared in the doorway. He was holding his phone loosely at his side, and his expression had shifted into something I had not seen from him before. Careful contained the look of a man who has just seen something outside and is deciding how to characterize it. "There is a woman at the front door," he said. "She has been standing across the street for 20 minutes. She is not a customer." He looked at me. "Her name is Gloria Santos. She says she lives across from a house on Birchwood Lane, and she has been carrying something for 3 years that she thinks belongs to you." Gloria Santos was 68 years old, broad-shouldered with silver hair cut short and practical, and a face that had the particular quality of someone who had spent decades paying attention to things other people walked past without noticing. She was wearing a blue fleece jacket and carrying a cardboard box that had been reinforced along the bottom with 2 strips of packing tape, the kind of reinforcement you add when a box has been moved and handled enough times that you have stopped trusting its original construction. She looked at the flower shop, looked at Kevin, looked at me, and said, "You are Richard Harmon." It was not a question. "I am," I said. "I lived across the street from your daughter's house on Birchwood Lane for 22 years, she said. "I want you to know that before I show you what I brought. Because I need you to understand that what I did because something felt wrong. Not because I had any proof, just because 22 years of living across from a house teaches you what it is supposed to look like. And one day it stopped looking that way." She set the box on the work table. 3 years of security camera footage, she said. "My son installed the system after a car break-in on the block. 2 cameras, one facing the street, one covering the side yard, both running continuously." She opened the box flap and showed us the contents, a stack of labeled hard drives, each one marked with a date range in black marker, the handwriting careful and consistent. I did not know what I was recording. I just knew I wanted to have it in case it ever mattered. Kevin pulled a chair out for her. She sat, folded her hands on the table, and told us what she had seen. She had watched Julian Voss carry boxes out of the house on a Tuesday afternoon in October 3 years ago. Not moving boxes, the kind of boxes that had been packed in a hurry, lids folded rather than taped, things sticking out at the edges. He had made 11 trips to a rented truck in 90 minutes. A woman Gloria did not recognize had stood at the front door directing him, pointing at things, occasionally carrying smaller items herself. She had watched strangers arrive with rolling suitcases every few days for the following 18 months, checking their phones for the door code, taking photographs of the porch, leaving 2 or 3 days later. She had watched a cleaning crew come and go on Monday mornings with the clockwork regularity of a professional service. She had watched Sophie stand on the sidewalk across the street one afternoon, holding Lily's hand, looking at the front window of the house. "She stood there for a long time," Gloria said. "The little girl tugged her arm twice and she did not move. Then the little girl said something, I could not hear what, and the woman bent down and said something back, and they walked away." Gloria looked at me steadily. "I did not know who she was until Marcus Holt showed me a photograph last week." Sophie beside me was looking at the table. "Tell him what was in the window," she said quietly. Gloria turned to me. "There was a sign," she said. "Dark blue letters on a white background. Diana's legacy." She paused. "It was in the front window of the house. The same window where your daughter used to keep a pot of yellow tulips every spring." I thought about Sophie standing on that sidewalk, holding Lily's hand, looking at her mother's name displayed in the window of the house that had been taken from her, used as the storefront for a charity fraud that had collected $180,000 from strangers who believed they were honoring a woman they had never met. "I tried to keep walking," Sophie said. She did not look up from the table. "I told Lily I was tired. She believed me." She stopped. I stood there for probably 4 minutes. It felt longer. There is a lamppost on the corner of Birchwood and Vine, and I held onto it because my legs stopped cooperating, and I needed something solid. She finally looked up at me. Then I made myself walk, because Lily was watching. The room was very quiet. Gloria reached into her jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. "My son went through the drives last week after Marcus called," she said. "He made a list of every significant event captured on the footage with timestamps. 41 entries." She placed the paper on the table. "Everything from the day the boxes were carried out to the last rental guest leaving 6 months ago. 41 entries. A documentary record of the systematic dismantling of my daughter's life, recorded by a woman across the street who had simply been paying attention." "Gloria," I said, "would you be willing to provide a formal statement and make these drives available as evidence?" She looked at me with the direct, unhurried eyes of a woman who had already made this decision before she walked through the door. "Mr. Harmon," she said, "I carried that box in and out of my garage for 3 years because I did not know who to give it to. Now I know." She pushed the box toward me across the table. "It is yours. It always should have been." I thanked her. She stood, shook my hand with a grip that was firm and unhurried, nodded once at Sophie, and walked back out through the shop. When her footsteps faded, the back room was very quiet. Sophie was looking at the box of hard drives on the table between us, and her expression had the quality of someone watching something that was taken from them being slowly, carefully returned. "That is enough for today," I said. "You and Lily should get some rest." "There is one more thing," Sophie said. She did not look away from the box. "Something I should have told you 3 days ago, but did not know how to start." She raised her eyes to me. "The letter you wrote. The real one. 6 years ago, the morning you flew to the Gulf rig. You said you left it on the kitchen counter." "I did," I said. "I never received it," she said. "But 2 weeks after you left, 2 weeks Dad. I came home and Eleanor was at the kitchen table. She had an envelope in front of her. She pushed it into her coat pocket when I walked in and said it was a bill she had already handled." Sophie's jaw set in the angle that was entirely her mother's. "I did not think about it again until last year, until I started understanding what she was capable of." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the table. "Robert," I answered. "I have just received a call from a man named Franklin Cross," Robert said. His voice carried the weight of something significant being handled with great care. "He is an attorney on Knox Street. He says he was Diana's private counsel, not our shared firm, separately retained 26 years ago." A pause. "He says he has been holding something for Sophie, something Diana left. And he says the time has come." I looked at my daughter across the table. She was already looking at me. "Set up the meeting," I said. "Tonight." Franklin Cross answered the door before we could knock. He was 75 years old and built like a man who had spent those years doing something purposeful with them. Broad shoulders, slightly stooped now by time rather than habit. White hair combed with the unhurried precision of someone who still believed that how you presented yourself in the morning was a form of respect for the day ahead. His handshake was firm and unhurried. His eyes were gray and very clear, the kind of eyes that had witnessed enough of human behavior to stop being surprised by most of it, and had arrived instead at something that was not detachment, but was very close to its more useful cousin. He looked at me for a long moment after we shook hands, studying my face with the directness of a man who had heard a great deal about me from a woman who was no longer alive to make the introduction herself. "Your wife spoke about you often," he said. "Come in." His office on Knox Street smelled like old books and coffee, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to rooms where important things have been kept safe for a very long time. 2 chairs had been arranged in front of his desk, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been expecting this meeting and had thought about how it should feel when it arrived. On the desk sat 2 items. A sealed envelope cream-colored the flap, closed with dark wax, and beside it, a thin folder. I recognized Diana's handwriting on the front of the envelope before Franklin had finished pulling his chair out. The letters were careful and deliberate, the handwriting of a woman who had always believed that how you wrote something mattered as much as what you wrote. For Sophie, when the time comes. My throat closed so completely that I reached for the arm of the chair and held it. "How long did you know Diana?" Robert asked. His legal pad was already open. 26 years, Franklin said. He settled into his chair with the unhurried manner of a man who understood that some conversations needed room to breathe, and that rushing them was a form of disrespect to the people they concerned. "She came to me separately from your shared firm because she wanted counsel that was entirely her own. Not adversarial, she trusted you completely, Richard. But she was a careful woman. She understood that there are things a person needs to protect independently." He paused. "Particularly when she suspected she might not have as much time as she would have liked. She knew she was sick," I said, "before she told me." Franklin's expression was gentle and honest in equal measure. "She suspected for several months before the diagnosis was confirmed. She used that time to put certain things in order." He opened the folder. "This is a codicil, a legal addendum to your primary joint will. It was drafted, witnessed, and executed entirely independently. 2 witnesses completely unconnected to either family or either firm. Fully valid under the California Probate Code." He folded his hands on the desk. "I should explain why I held it rather than filing it through probate immediately after Diana passed. Her instructions to me were very specific. The codicil contains a contingency clause. It becomes operative only in the event of what Diana's own language describes as fraudulent deprivation of Sophie's assets." He met my eyes steadily. "Her instruction was to hold the document until there was documented evidence that the contingency had been triggered. Filing it prematurely without that evidence would have exposed it to legal challenge and potentially rendered it unenforceable." Robert had leaned forward. His reading glasses were on and his pen was moving. "When Eleanor contacted my office twice last spring," Franklin continued, "asking whether I still held any documents related to Diana's estate, I understood that the contingency had been triggered. Someone was looking for this document because they were afraid of what it contained." He looked at me. "What does the codicil address specifically?" Robert asked. Franklin slid the folder across the desk. "The primary clause," he said, "addresses Sophie's inheritance rights in the event of fraudulent deprivation. Diana's exact language reads as follows." He opened the folder to a marked page and read carefully and precisely the way a man reads something he has read many times before and still treats as though it deserves full attention. "Should Sophie be deprived of any asset, property, or financial inheritance through forgery, coercion, deception, or any other fraudulent means, all such transactions shall be deemed void and unenforceable, and full ownership and entitlement shall revert to Sophie unconditionally, regardless of any subsequent transfer of title or liquidation of assets." The room was very quiet. Robert set his pen down. He read the clause again silently, his lips moving slightly at the edges. Then he looked up at me, and in his expression, the careful, controlled expression of a man who had spent 40 years learning not to show premature certainty, I saw something I had not seen since I walked off that plane at LAX. "Every transfer Eleanor executed is void," Robert said quietly. "The house reverts to Sophie. The fraudulent accounts are recoverable. The civil judgment proceeds from here with this as its foundation." He looked at Franklin. "Combined with the forged power of attorney, the wire fraud documentation, the AI voice fraud evidence, and everything else we have assembled, this codicil is the cornerstone. Everything else we built supports it. This is what holds the entire structure together." I reached out and picked up the sealed envelope from the desk. Diana's handwriting. "For Sophie. When the time comes." 26 years, this envelope had sat in Franklin Cross's locked drawer on Knox Street. 26 years while Diana raised a daughter and got sick and died, and while I went overseas, and while Eleanor dismantled everything we had built piece by piece, and while Sophie sold her mother's jewelry and held her daughter's hand on a sidewalk outside her stolen house and told herself to keep moving. And this piece of paper, Diana's last act of protection for the child she loved more than anything in this world, had been waiting 2 miles from where it was needed. "She knew," I said. My voice came out rough and barely above a breath. "Diana didn't know the specifics. She couldn't have. But she knew that a man grieving alone with assets and a trusting daughter was vulnerable. She knew that love without legal teeth is just a feeling." I pressed my fingers carefully against the wax seal. "She loved Sophie with everything she had, and she made sure that love had teeth." Franklin nodded slowly. "She was the most prepared client I have ever had," he said, "and the most quietly fierce." Robert began photographing the documents. I held the envelope in both hands and looked at Diana's handwriting, and felt the particular weight of being loved by someone who had thought far enough ahead to protect the people you both loved, even after she was gone. Then Franklin opened his desk drawer one more time. He produced a second envelope, smaller, newer, no-wax seal, slightly bent at one corner, as though it had been carried in a pocket for a long time before it arrived here. He held it for a moment, before placing it carefully on the desk between us. "There is one more thing," he said. His voice had shifted careful in a way that was different from before, the way a person's voice shifts when they are about to hand over something they have been guarding and are not entirely certain how it will land. 6 years ago, a plain envelope arrived in my office mail. No return address. Inside was a handwritten letter and a note that said in handwriting that appeared to be yours, Richard. "Hold this for Sophie." I stared at the envelope. "I never sent that," I said. "I know," Franklin said quietly. "I have known for some time, but I had no proof of anything and no basis to act, so I held it." His gray eyes were steady and kind. "The letter inside is in your handwriting. It is addressed to Sophie, and she has never seen it." My hands were not steady when I reached for that envelope. They had not been steady for several days now, and I had stopped pretending otherwise because a man my age sitting in a room where his dead wife's handwriting was on one envelope and his stolen letter was in another had earned the right to let things show. "This belongs to Sophie," Franklin said simply. "It always did." I carried the envelope against my ribs the entire drive back. Not in my briefcase. Against my chest, where I could feel it with every breath, 6 years of distance pressed into one sealed page that my daughter had never been allowed to read. Martha answered Sophie's door before I knocked twice. She looked at my face and stepped aside. Sophie was sitting on the edge of the bed with her shoes still on. Lily was at the window table, coloring book open, not coloring, watching me the way she watched everything quietly and completely. I sat down and placed Diana's envelope on the bed between us. Sophie looked at her mother's handwriting. Her face went through 3 things in 2 seconds. Recognition, confusion, and then something slow and deep that moved through her like a tide coming in. She broke the seal. Read. When she finished, she pressed the letter flat against her chest and closed her eyes. "She knew," Sophie said. "She says she was afraid of what the distance might allow. She says she needed love to have somewhere to land, even if she wasn't there to aim it." Martha pressed both hands over her mouth. I set the second envelope beside the first smaller, no-wax seal. "I wrote this 6 years ago," I said. "The morning I flew to the rig. Eleanor mailed it to Franklin's office instead of giving it to you." Sophie read it without speaking. When she finished, tears ran freely down her face and she did not try to stop them. She held both envelopes against her heart. "I thought you stopped," she said. "I thought you just stopped." "Not once," I said. "Not for a single day." Lily stood up from her chair. She unzipped her backpack and produced a cracked iPad with sticker-covered case and held it out to me with both hands. "I have something," she said. "I kept it because I thought someday the right person would come." I pressed play. Eleanor's voice filled the room. "She won't. Richard sends every month without checking. By the time she understands what has happened, there will be nothing left to understand." Sophie went completely still. I picked up my phone. "Come to the motel," I told Robert. "Right now." Robert arrived in 18 minutes. He sat in the chair beside the nightstand, placed his own recorder face up next to the iPad, and listened to all 11 minutes and 40 seconds without moving a single muscle. Sophie sat beside me on the bed. Martha stood by the window. Lily had fallen asleep against her mother's side, one hand still loosely gripping the edge of the comforter. When the recording ended, Robert leaned forward. "I need to be direct about the legal standing of this file," he said. He looked at Lily sleeping, then at me. "California is a two-party consent state. Under Penal Code Section 632, recording a private conversation without the consent of all parties is unlawful. Lily was not a party to Eleanor's conversation and did not intentionally record it." He paused. "This cannot be introduced as standalone evidence in a criminal trial." Sophie's breath caught. "However," Robert continued, and his voice carried the particular weight of a man who has saved the essential thing for after the difficult thing, "it is admissible in civil proceedings. And more importantly, it tells us exactly where to look. Every name mentioned, every transaction referenced, every action described. This recording does not convict Eleanor by itself. It builds the road that leads to everything that does." Sophie exhaled slowly. Lily stirred, opened one eye, looked at Robert and said, "Does it help?" Robert looked at my 8-year-old granddaughter with an expression I had never seen from him in 30 years. "Yes," he said simply. "It changes everything." Lily closed her eye and went back to sleep. Robert left at midnight. I sat at the small desk by the window and did not attempt sleep because sleep was not available to me, and pretending otherwise seemed like a waste of the dark. At 11:43, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. "Richard." Eleanor's voice came through steady and unhurried, the voice of a woman performing composure for an audience of one. "I think it is time we talked." I said nothing. "I understand things have become complicated," she said. "But there is still a path forward that does not require courts or attorneys or any of this becoming public. For the sake of everyone involved, including Sophie, I think you should consider—" "You held a funeral for me," I said. My voice came out very quiet. "You stood beside my daughter at a grave that had my name on it, and you cried. Then you went home to the house you had already transferred out of her name, and you wired yourself another month of her father's money. I let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. There is no path forward that does not go through a courtroom. I will see you there." I ended the call. At 6:12 the following morning, Agent Sarah Jenkins called. "The Cayman account is frozen. she said. As of 4:47 this morning, Julian Voss's passport has been flagged at all major departure points. Eleanor's as well. A pause. They are not going anywhere, Richard. I looked at the charcoal suit hanging on the back of the closet door. Robert had brought it the previous evening without explanation, which was the kind of thing Robert did when he had already thought 3 steps further than the present moment and wanted to make sure the present moment was ready. It was the suit I had worn to Diana's funeral 14 years ago. I reached out and straightened the jacket on the hanger, smoothed the lapel with 2 fingers, and stood there for a moment in the early morning quiet of a motel room in a small town outside Los Angeles. Then I began to get ready. Sophie straightened my collar before we went in, 2 fingers careful and deliberate adjusting the lapel of the charcoal suit, the way her mother used to do before anything that mattered. She did not say anything. Neither did I. Some things do not require language. The hearing room was full. Robert sat at the table with 6 weeks of documentation stacked in clean, precise order. Marcus Holt was behind him. Agent Sarah Jenkins sat along the wall in a dark jacket with the particular stillness of someone who had waited 4 years for this room and intended to be present in every second of it. Patricia Vance was there. Gloria Santos, the woman from Phoenix, 71 years old, who had waited 11 years and flown in the previous evening and shaken my hand in the corridor and said simply, "It is time." Eleanor sat at the opposite table in a slate-gray blazer with a leather portfolio in front of her and 2 attorneys on either side. She looked composed. She looked in control. She looked like a woman who still believed she was managing the narrative. She had not yet seen me. I was standing outside the rail. Robert stood. "The people call Richard James Harmon." I walked through the rail. Eleanor looked up. What happened to her face in that moment was not dramatic. It did not shatter. It simply emptied. Every constructed layer draining simultaneously, leaving something underneath that was flat and exposed, and for the first time in every year, I had known her completely unguarded. I took the stand. "Please state your name for the record," Robert said. "Richard James Harmon," I said. I looked directly at Eleanor. "The death certificate currently in your possession was forged." "I did not die. I am standing in this room, and I have been sitting in that gallery for 2 hours watching you pretend otherwise." Judge Patricia Owens leaned forward. Eleanor's lead attorney reached for her arm. Eleanor did not move. I began to speak. Robert called on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the hearing. "She entered a plea," he said. "All counts: wire fraud forgery, identity theft, AI voice fraud, charity fraud, conservatorship fraud. Sentencing is February." A pause. "The civil judgment is entered, Richard. Birchwood reverts to Sophie. The fraudulent debt, all of it is void. Civil recovery of $3.5 million stands in Sophie's favor." I sat at the motel desk and looked out the window at the December morning for a long moment. "Thank you," I said, "for all of it." "Go get your daughter," Robert said, "and go home." Robert met us on Birchwood Lane at noon. He was standing at the front door with a single key on a plain ring. He handed it to Sophie without ceremony, because ceremony was not what the moment needed. Sophie held the key in her palm. Lily was already at the door, backpack on, shifting her weight from foot to foot with the barely contained energy of a child who had been patient for a very long time and had reached the absolute limit of it. Martha stood beside me. For the first time since she had believed her brother was dead, she was not standing alone. Sophie looked at me. "Together," she said. "Together," I said. She put the key in the lock. It turned with a clean, solid click, the sound of something that had been closed far too long, opening exactly the way it was supposed to. The door swung inward. Lily went first. Her footsteps rang on the hardwood floor, quick, purposeful moving from room to room, with the energy of a child reclaiming something that had always belonged to her. Kitchen, hallway, the back bedroom. Then the sound of a window being pushed open somewhere at the back of the house because Lily had always needed air. Sophie stood in the middle of the empty living room and did not move. The afternoon light came through the front windows. The way light comes through windows in houses that have been waiting, pale and still and very patient. She reached out and touched the wall beside her with her fingertips. Then she turned to me. "Dad," she said, "we're home." They say God places exactly what we can carry into our hands. I believe that now. But I also believe this: I made it easy for everything that happened. I chose distance over presence, wire transfers over phone calls, trust without verification. I told myself the money was enough. It was not. It was never enough. This is a family story about what absence costs, not just in dollars, but in years, in letters never received, in a little girl talking to an empty grave. If these grandpa stories have taught me anything, it is that staying close is not a luxury. It is the only real protection a father can offer. So let me say it plainly, from one father to anyone listening: do not be like me. Do not let the years pile up until your family story becomes a story of survival instead of love. Show up. Verify the things that matter. Stay. In my experience, family betrayal does not begin with the villain. It begins with the gap the people who love you leave open. If these grandpa stories moved something in you, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. And subscribe so you never miss what comes next. From the bottom of this old heart, thank you for staying until the very last word. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements crafted entirely to carry a message worth hearing. If that is not for you, step away with grace, find what feeds your soul, and take good care of yourself.